If folks want to have a seat, we're about to get started. Welcome. My name is Steve Rothstein. I am the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Foundation and the Library, it is a special pleasure to welcome each and every one of you tonight. You're in for a rare treat. I also want to thank our lead sponsor, the Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. After this great program, Larry will be signing copies of his book that are available for sale in the gift shop and be signing them out there, which we really appreciate. Before I talk about Larry for a second, I want to talk about Eileen McNamara, who's going to do a great job as moderating. She's a professor of practice at journalism at Brandeis, a former Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist in the Globe. Her writings, you see her all over the place, and she's actually in the midst of a biography about Mrs. Shriver, which all of us are very eager. She has to finish writing it first, but we're very eager to read when she works on that. Larry Tye is also an award-winning journalist. He's in the Globe, a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, and the author of several notable books, including one he co-authored with Kitty Dukakis called Shock, Satchel, and many others. He also, in addition to his writing, runs the Boston-based Health Coverage Fellowship, does great work there. So I could spend the next hour talking about this book because I loved it. It's a fantastic book. It really captures Bobby in so many different ways, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to read a few sentences from a few reviews that I think, again, capture some of the essence. One of the reviewers said, Larry Tye has done his homework. He has read the books and articles, interviewed hundreds of family members, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, made use of newly released material at the Kennedy Library, and has produced a nuanced, balanced, and mostly favorable portrait. Another one of the many, many reviewers said, we're in Larry Tye's debt. Let me say that again. We're in Larry Tye's debt for bringing back to life the young presidential candidate who spoke these words and for a brief moment, almost a century ago, instilled hope in the future of angry, fearful Americans. Join me to welcome our speakers tonight.
Well, thank you all for coming. Larry and I are old friends, so this will be sort of an informal conversation, which we encourage you to participate in during the Q&A section. So I wanted to start, Larry, in the present, since we're going to spend most of tonight talking about the past. I hear echoes of 1968 in the 2016 presidential campaign, and as I read your book, I saw the echoes. Can you talk about that? I know you've been traveling the country talking about your book as this campaign's been unfolding. What do you see that is similar, different?
So I don't see enough echoes of the 1968 campaign, and I wish we could see more. And I think that what Bobby Kennedy does, he was no saint, but he offers a standard that I think today's candidates should aspire to. And I want to give you an example. So I wrote this book in part because as a lifelong journalist like you were, I was inspired by and confounded by the fact that so many of the people who were my role models in journalism, who would never, ever get close to a politician in their lives, fell in love with Bobby Kennedy. And the people like David Halberstam and Bill Kovich, the curator of the Nieman Fellowship, the only time in their lives that they ever left journalism was for the 1968 campaign. And I'd like to tell you about one journalist who I think offers a model of what journalists should think about today, but more importantly, candidates. And it was a guy at the Washington Post named Dick Harwood, or as his colleagues knew him, Dick Black Death Harwood. And that was partly because he was a Marine who helped take the hill at Iwo Jima, but more importantly, he was somebody that if he got you in his radar and you did anything wrong, it was Black Death to you. And this was a guy that Ben Bradley assigned at the beginning of the 1968 campaign to cover Bobby Kennedy, figuring that this was a guy who would never fall in love with him. And the first experience Harwood had in that campaign was to go out and play touch football with Bobby Kennedy. And he came back with a bloody nose that he thought might be broken. And his first reaction to it was, Bobby Kennedy plays dirty in politics and on the football field. And he liked him even less than he had when he started out in the campaign. But over the course of that campaign, he watched Bobby Kennedy do something that would be unheard of today in the political world. He saw him go into white communities and black communities and give precisely the same speech. He told people exactly the opposite of what they wanted to hear, but what he thought they ought to hear. And in the context today that is so relevant of what's going on in cities today and in terms of racial tension, he would tell white and black communities that, number one, we need safe streets. But the only way we're going to get safe streets is to have racial justice. And it was a counterintuitive and an unwelcome message in both communities. And Harwood was so impressed by this guy, who was the opposite of a demagogue, that near the end of the campaign, he went back to his editor, Ben Bradley, and he said, "You've got to take me off the campaign because I've fallen in love with Bobby Kennedy." And Ben Bradley, who 10 years before had fallen in love with the Kennedys, said, "No way, you're going to stick it out." The most eloquent of all the eulogies written about Bobby Kennedy was not, as we thought, the eulogy written by Ted Kennedy. It was not even the eulogy written by David Kennedy about his father. It was the eulogy that Dick Black Death Harwood wrote about the candidate that he had despised at the beginning. And that is what I think, this is a long-winded way of answering your question.
It certainly is.
It is. But the one word that is missing, most missing with either candidate today, a word that nobody from the press corps would ever think of sticking on either candidate, is the word authentic. And that is what the press was convinced that Bobby Kennedy was in 1968.
Mm-hmm. I guess when I'm thinking about the echoes that I hear, I think you've sort of nailed it with the issue of racial division. One of the things that made Bobby Kennedy pretty extraordinary in 1968 was, I mean, those of us old enough to remember, certainly remember in the aftermath of the assassination of Martin Luther King, when Bobby Kennedy goes into Indianapolis and stands on the back of a flatbed truck and speaks to a largely African-American crowd. And there's the silence, if you listen to the tape now, is deafening. When we were in a moment in 1968 of the kind of racial animus and division that in many ways we see now. And we had candidates exploiting that in 1968. But in 1968, we had a white man who could walk into Indianapolis and speak to that crowd. And of course, there were no riots in Indianapolis that night.
So can I take you back and tell a little bit of that story of what happened that night in Indianapolis, because it is so relevant to today. And I want to ask before I do that, how are you doing all this with no notes here? This is kind of extraordinary.
I took notes on your book.
You did? Okay, great. So what happened was, you may remember, anybody who was, how many people here remember the 1968, lived through 68 campaign? Wow, a lot of people. So so in 68, you will remember that the first contested primary that Bobby Kennedy entered that year was in Indiana.
Right.
And he knew about as much about Indiana as I do, which is about nothing. When he entered that primary, he joked one day when one page of his speech blew off in the wind. He said, "There goes my farm policy." And it was true. One day in the middle of the campaign, he flies into Indianapolis and he's greeted at the airport by the then very young mayor named Richard Lugar, who went on to become an old senator. And Lugar says, "I've got horrible news for you. Martin Luther King was just shot and killed." And Lugar says, "You will not go in tonight and deliver the speech you were planning to give in the middle of the black ghetto." And he says, "You won't go in and do that because you might not come out alive and because you'll create a riot there." And Bobby Kennedy, as he often did when he got advice from people like that, is he listened to it, he looked like he was taking it very seriously, and then he ignored it. And he went into the ghetto that night, and he stood up in the back of a pickup truck, and for the next 5 minutes, he delivered what might have been the most pitch-perfect speech that a white politician has ever delivered in Black America. And I'd love to just read you a few lines of that speech because I can't begin to summarize it with the justice that it deserves. And so you got to understand, he's giving this speech on the way into the ghetto that night. His aides give him some notes that they've prepared. And he takes those notes before he gets up on the top of this truck and he tosses them out. And he delivers everything I'm about to read to you extemporaneously. He says, I'm only going to talk to you for just a minute or so this evening because I have some very sad news for all of you. Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight. And you can hear, if you listen to the YouTube tape of that, people in the audience going, oh no, and it can't be true. And this is the first time just about everybody, the hundreds of people who were there, have heard what happened. And Bobby, in a louder voice, and I'm not going to pretend to try to be able to emulate a Kennedy accent, but he continues in a louder voice and says, for those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. And I want to stop for another second and tell you that in the 5 years, this is 1968, in the 5 years from the death of Jack Kennedy to this speech, Bobby Kennedy has never in public talked about what happened to his brother. And even this night, when he's doing it for the first time, he can't manage to say the word Jack or my brother. It's a member of my family. He continues, what we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice towards those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. So I ask you tonight to return home to say a prayer for the family of Martin Luther King. Yeah, it's true. But more importantly, to say a prayer for our own country, which all of us love, a prayer for understanding and that compassion of which I spoke. Now, you were right. In that night in America, for anybody who remembers back, you'll remember that a part of Washington was burned down. A piece of Chicago was burned down. In more than 100 cities across America, there were race riots. One of the only cities in America, along with Boston, that didn't riot that night was Indianapolis, and that was because of Robert Francis Kennedy. From that night to the end of the campaign, I can say without hyperbole, and you should never trust a journalist who says they can say anything without hyperbole, but I can say without hyperbole, Bobby Kennedy was the most popular white man in Black America. When he would campaign in ghettos, there would be a sign that would greet him that said simply, white, but all right. Now, that may not sound like much, but in 1968, for any white politician to inspire a sign like that was something extraordinary. And the irony was, back in his clueless days on civil rights, when he was first Attorney General, there was one person in America who understood how good Bobby Kennedy could be on civil rights, and that was a guy named Martin Luther King Jr. And the irony is that 10 years later, the time that was proven was at the night of Martin Luther King's death, when he did everything that Martin Luther King realized he could do on civil rights.
Martin Luther King said, in fact, didn't he, that there's good in there. We just have to find it.
Reach down and pull it out, and it came out that night. And, it was,
and one thing he also said in that speech that night, that I can't for the life of me imagine being delivered on the back of a flatbed truck to that crowd, is he quoted Aeschylus. I mean, who among our political leaders has enough respect for the intelligence of the American voter that in that tragic moment would quote Aeschylus to ordinary people?
Who among our political leaders has enough intelligence to be able to quote Aeschylus?
Well, right, there is that.
Bobby Kennedy couldn't have done this earlier in his life. The moment that he started reading Greek tragedy was the moment he needed Greek tragedy to help him make it through his life, which was the moment in 1963 when his brother Jack was killed. And Bobby Kennedy used to, For entertainment, when he had to relieve stress, he would go out and play a bone-crushing game of touch football. Post-assassination, he would go to his room and read Greek tragedies that his sister-in-law, Jackie, had tuned him into, and it was extraordinary.
Right. So, you know, we've always read, those of us who have read a lot of history of the Kennedy family, we've read about the good Bobby and the bad Bobby, the two Bobbies. You've done something extraordinary in your book, which is you've integrated this historical figure for us. Take us back to the Bobby that was not quite so compassionate, the Bobby that was a virulent anti-communist and a Cold Warrior, Joe Kennedy's kid, whose first job in the public arena was working for Joe McCarthy. How did that happen?
So can I take you back to a particular scene that I think captures who he
You're
was?
going to take me wherever you want,
Wanted.
Larry. That's clear. So, of course, feel
This
free to
brings
ignore any of my questions.
But one of the many things, Steve didn't have time to read Eileen's entire resume, but one of the many things that she did, and you can hear in the tone of her questions how she could have done that. There were lots of heroes. Anybody who read the Spotlight series on the clergy sex abuse remembers that story. Anybody who saw the movie remembers it. What you may not know is the one who kicked off that story, because she wouldn't give up the story, was Eileen McNamara in her columns. And
Thank you.
it wasn't just that she was a tough journalist. She was a tough journalist when it was appropriate to be a tough journalist, and when not giving up when her editors would discourage her or whatever they would do. She was the kind who stayed on the story. But it is great to be able to be here and say what I want to say as well when you're in spite of it. So I want to take you back to a scene in 1957, and it's a scene of a funeral. There was a big funeral happening in Wisconsin, and I don't know if anybody here remembers who was buried in 1957 in Appleton, Wisconsin, that might have made a big furor in terms of the context of what we're talking about, but it was a guy named Joe McCarthy. And at this funeral, the nearest airport was Green Bay, Wisconsin. And that day in 1957 of the funeral, that morning, a big military jet from Washington flies in. And out of that jet, it was like a scene from Monty Python. 19 U.S. senators pour out of it, 7 congressmen, and a whole collection of other celebrities. And they did what celebrities and congress people do when they go out to visit faraway places like Appleton, Wisconsin. They get out of the plane, they pour into big black stretch limousines, and they take off for Appleton. And the airport goes quiet, and it looks like the plane's about to shut down. Nobody else is going to get off, when suddenly a relatively short, thin congressional staffer named Robert F. Kennedy gets off the plane. And he gets off at just the moment he wants to when the airport is quiet. Nobody there to give him a ride in a stretch limousine, not even any yellow cabs there. And thankfully for him, there was a reporter there from the Milwaukee newspaper who gives him a ride to Appleton. And it was the perfect kind of a Kennedy ride in a convertible car that was going really fast, and the wind blowing his hair. And when he gets to the church in Appleton, all the celebrities are out there in the church pews, and Bobby Kennedy goes up to the choir loft where nobody can see him. When he gets to the graveside service, all the celebrities are over here, and Bobby Kennedy goes over here where nobody can see him. After the funeral, when all the reporters are there, and in those days when reporters covered a funeral, they wrote very boring stories that made sure of putting into the story every name of every celebrity who was there. And he goes up to all the reporters and he says, "Would you mind leaving my name out?" Now, in those days, when a politician asked you that, you often obliged. When the politician was named Kennedy, you always obliged, and his name showed up in none of the stories. And luckily for me, the reporter who had given him a ride from the airport to the funeral wanted to purge his soul 50 years later, the fact that he had left out the one name he had left out of his story because Bobby Kennedy had asked him, and he told the story of what Bobby Kennedy did that day. And I tell that story now in answer to your question because I think it says who Bobby Kennedy was back in 1957. And half of what it says is that he was a very loyal guy, that 4 years before, when he didn't have a job, he was a recent law school graduate, Joe McCarthy gave him a job. And Bobby Kennedy believed back then that Joe McCarthy was the one guy in Washington who was standing up to the communist threat, not just in the Soviet Union, but in the State Department and other government offices. And so he went to work for him because McCarthy offered him a job, because Joe Kennedy had given money to Joe McCarthy, and he would give him anything he wanted, but also because he believed he was a Cold Warrior back then, and he believed very much in what Joe McCarthy stood for. And so he went to work for him willingly. So that was not our Bobby Kennedy, the liberal icon that he had become at the end. So one piece of what it said that he went to McCarthy's funeral, even though his brother Jack said, stay away, is that he was loyal to McCarthy. And that's something that I think it says nice about who Bobby Kennedy was. McCarthy had given him a job when he needed one. The other piece of what it said, the way he did things in 1957, was he made sure that even though he was going to be loyal and go to the funeral, nobody would ever know that he was at the funeral, and nobody would hold it against his brother, who wanted to be president in 3 years. And so he went there.
And who managed to skip the vote when it came time to censure McCarthy.
Absolutely did that. He had a health issue, and he used that health issue to let him skip the vote. But the other piece of who Bobby Kennedy was, if he was loyal to Joe McCarthy in showing up there, he was even more loyal to his brother, Jack Kennedy. And so he was going to make sure that what he did in showing up there wasn't going to come back and bite Jack Kennedy. So he had it both ways in a perfect way, and that was who Bobby Kennedy was. He was a loyal guy. He had actually, I don't know how many of you know that the report that censured Joe McCarthy was a Republican report, because the Republicans controlled the Senate then, but 80% of the report was based on the Democratic report that was written by Bobby Kennedy. So he was loyal to Joe McCarthy, but he was loyal to what his honest role was required for him to tell the truth about what Joe McCarthy had done. So he played it 3 different ways. Loyal to Joe McCarthy, loyal to his role in the Senate telling the truth about the bad guy that Joe McCarthy had become in the Army McCarthy hearings, and loyal most of all, as he was throughout his life, to the Kennedy family and to ensuring that his brother would become president in 1960.
Did he take away something else from working for Joe McCarthy on those hearings? I mean, Joe McCarthy's chief aide was Roy Cohn, one of the more ruthless lawyers in D.C., which is saying something. And his tactics became Bobby's tactics in many ways during periods of his life. When you think about the way that Joe McCarthy went after people he perceived as leftist communist threats in the State Department, isn't in some ways that the way Bobby went after Jimmy Hoffa?
Yes, so I want to just say one word about Roy Cohn. So Bobby Kennedy never blamed Joe McCarthy for most of the things Joe McCarthy did, because he liked Joe McCarthy. The one he always blamed was Roy Cohn, who he hated, who was his big rival working for McCarthy. Roy Cohn had a more senior title to Bobby, and Roy Cohn lorded it over Bobby, and Bobby never forgave him for that. So for his entire life, including his time as Attorney General, he did anything he could to get back at Roy Cohn, which was not a bad target. We know Roy Cohn in later years was a tutor to Donald Trump, and he was somebody who, Roy Cohn was probably near death at the time when young Donald Trump needed sort of a tutor in the ways of Washington, and Roy Cohn, it was very fitting that he
obliged.
He totally obliged, but in terms of using Roy Cohn-like tactics, I want to again just tell one really quick story. And you may think, you're probably all experts in here. We're at the great Kennedy Library, and experts in how Jack Kennedy was elected. And you may think that Jack Kennedy was elected because of the debates, and he didn't have a 5 o'clock shadow, and he outshone Nixon in debates. Or you may think that it was because he got lots of votes from Chicago graveyards and whatever happened in Chicago. The true story in my mind, and more importantly, the true story in Dwight Eisenhower's mind about what made the difference in that election was a deal that Bobby Kennedy did near the end of the election when he went. You remember that Martin Luther King was arrested on a trumped-up charge of driving without a proper license or whatever it was in Georgia. And this was very close to the November election in 1960. And Martin Luther King was in jail, and Jack Kennedy made a very nice but not very useful, sympathetic phone call to Coretta King saying, I feel badly that your husband's in jail. Coretta was 6 or 7 months pregnant, and Martin Luther King was being taken to a prison where it looked like he might never come back alive. And everybody gave Jack Kennedy a lot of credit. The truth is, behind the scenes, the real orchestration of Martin Luther King getting out of jail alive was what Bobby Kennedy did. And Bobby Kennedy arranged through the governor of Georgia and through the governor's brother, who was, I think, the head of the Democratic Party, and through a bunch of people, he got to the sentencing judge. And he had arranged that he would call the sentencing judge on the telephone to talk about what he could do to get Martin Luther King out of jail. And he called the judge and said, if we are ever elected president and you would like to come and visit the White House, you'd be a very welcome guest at the White House. And the judge later took him up on that offer. And the judge arranged for Martin Luther King to get out of jail. And the difference, a lot of people think that the difference in that election was made in the vote in Chicago, but the difference was, in fact, in 4 or 5 Midwestern states, the black votes that had historically gone to the party of Lincoln and that had gone to Eisenhower and Nixon, enough of those black votes went over to Jack Kennedy because in the black community, the Sunday before the election, a little pamphlet went out saying, you can vote for Richard Nixon, the candidate without a heart, or you can vote for Jack Kennedy, essentially saying the candidate who got Martin Luther King out of jail. And that was what, in the minds of not only lots of people who were watching the election, but in the minds of Dwight Eisenhower, that was what made the difference in the election in 1960 in 4 or 5 very close Midwestern states. And it was, this is a long-winded answer to your question, but it was Bobby Kennedy orchestrating, using Roy Cohn kind of techniques, going behind the scenes, making a phone call. How many lawyers are there in the audience out here now? Right. So is it kosher to have a lawyer like Bobby Kennedy make a behind-the-scenes call to the sentencing judge saying, let him out of jail? It's great politics, and it's not exactly something that you'd want to be telling your law students about. But Bobby Kennedy did it. He did it in a Roy Cohn kind of technique, and it was one of many things that he learned all of those techniques brilliantly, and that made the difference in the 1960 election.
And there were lots of incidents like that, not all of them as, as beneficent as calling to try to get somebody out of jail, right? I mean, Hubert Humphrey ended that campaign saying that he hated that little son of a bitch, didn't he?
He did.
And he didn't mean Jack, he meant Bobby. So he could alienate people. Tactics he used to say about Joe McCarthy, well, he's right. If he's right, why do the tactics matter? That all changed, right? I mean, when you're talking about the president's assassination, you're talking really about an existential change in someone's attitude toward the world.
Yes. So if anybody could ever have had an epiphany moment, it was the assassination of Jack Kennedy and what that did to Bobby Kennedy. And so nobody ever goes from being something that they never were to something entirely new. But with Bobby Kennedy, we're all some balance of tough and tender. And with Bobby Kennedy, the dial was way over on the tough side in his early Joe McCarthy days, in his early days of the White House and getting his brother elected president. And after the assassination, he started doing something quite extraordinary for Kennedy, which was reading books and enjoying the idea that instead of going out and playing touch football, you could sit home and read a book. He discovered the fact that you could lose everything. The Kennedys seemed like they had everything going their way, and suddenly it was all gone. His brother Jack, his closest friend, was dead. The hated Lyndon Johnson was now in the White House and made it clear that he had no use for Bobby from almost moment one. J. Edgar Hoover, who Bobby had made put his telephone, there was a hotline that went from the Attorney General's office to the FBI Director's office. And that telephone, in the early days of the Kennedy administration, was on Hoover's secretary's desk. So Bobby would pick up the phone, and he'd get Mrs. Grundy and not Hoover on the telephone. And Bobby Kennedy insisted that that phone go on Hoover's desk. The day after the assassination, that phone went back on Mrs. Grundy's desk because Hoover was sending a message to Bobby Kennedy. And He had lost it all, and instead of giving up on everything, he just started recognizing parts of life that he had never had to deal with, including losing things and how you were going to come back. And Bobby Kennedy spent 7 horrible months in as deep a depression as anybody could ever go through. He had rallied for a month right after his brother's death to pull the family together and help pull the country together, but he lost it after that. And even when he went and ran for senator from New York, it wasn't until midway through that campaign, mid-October, when it looked like he could do something that a Kennedy had never done before, which was lose an election, that Bobby Kennedy started coming out of his depression. And if his balance was way over here on the tough side, from the assassination to the end of his life, the dial started going to a tender side that I don't think he knew was there and that the country never knew was there, but made him a very, very different person from that moment on.
And some of the lack of tenderness you might have seen was just lack of experience. It's sort of hard to say about people as wealthy and as well-traveled as the Kennedy children were. They were closeted. They lived in a very pampered environment. I mean, can you talk a little bit about when Bobby went to Mississippi with Marion Wright and saw poverty and hunger for the first time, I think, and the impact that had on him?
I'll do whatever you tell me to do.
That's what
that
I'm
was
telling
what
you to do.
So we want to go to Mississippi, and there's a hearing, like many congressional committees do. They have a hearing in Washington about hunger and the idea that there's hunger in America. And this is 1966, I think, and at a time when people didn't think there were food stamp programs, there were all kinds of welfare programs that were supposed to have eliminated hunger in America. And they hear testimony from Marion Wright about hunger. She's a young civil rights lawyer, the first black lawyer, I think, ever entered into the bar in Mississippi, and she tells them about hunger in America, and they say this can't be true. So they go down to Mississippi, and they have a hearing looking at hunger in America. And all the senators at that committee listen very dutifully and are very upset by what they hear, but all but 2 senators at the end of the hearing fly back to a nice weekend in Washington. 2 senators stick behind. One of them is named Clark. He's the chair of the subcommittee. The other one is named Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy says, I've heard about it. I want you to show it to me. So Marion Wright, young civil rights lawyer, thinks, I get a chance to actually show senators something. So she takes Bobby Kennedy and Senator Clark to the middle of the Mississippi Delta. On the one hand, it's the breadbasket of America, and on the other hand, it's one of the poorest places in America. And she shows them around and shows them some African Americans living in poverty. And they're wandering around, and there are a bunch of journalists there with them. And at one point, Bobby Kennedy, thinking that nobody else is with him, goes into a shack in the Mississippi Delta, breadbasket of America, but also one of the poorest places in America. And he sees this is a shack that has a dirt floor and that has a clothesline in the living room and that has in the refrigerator a jar of peanut butter. And on the floor is a toddler who is sitting there with flies flying overhead and just sitting on the floor. And Bobby Kennedy, in his great Senate suit, gets down on the floor, which is the way Bobby Kennedy always related to kids, at their eye level, gets down on the floor with this kid, thinking that nobody is watching, not knowing that a nosy, soon-to-be Globe reporter named Curtis Wilkie is watching. Gets down on the floor with this child, and for the next 15 minutes, Curtis Wilkie watches him trying to make some contact with the child. The child has a bloated stomach. The child has every physical sign of somebody who is totally malnourished. Curtis Wilkie is close enough, and another reporter who's watching this, that they can see tears streaming down the face of this U.S. senator who's trying to make some human contact with this toddler. That was the level that Bobby Kennedy, from the death of his brother on, always related to people, and he related best to children. After that, a normal senator would get upset with it and would go back to Washington and maybe rail against it. Bobby Kennedy did 2 things that were extraordinary, that only Bobby Kennedy, and I can say that, you should never trust a journalist who says they can say anything without hyperbole, but I can say without hyperbole that I think he was unique in the annals of the Senate in terms of somebody who would do these 2 things. One thing is, Monday morning, he went in to see his pal, Orville Freeman, who was the agriculture secretary, and he said, Orville, there are people starving in America. And Freeman said, no, we've got a food stamp program. There can't be anybody starving. And Bobby said, no, it takes a couple dollars. You need money to buy food stamps, and there are people in Mississippi that I just saw that don't have the money to buy food stamps. And Orville Freeman and Bobby Kennedy made a deal that they would each send an aide back to Mississippi, and if it was true that there were people starving there, that Orville Freeman would change the rules of the food stamp program. And of course, they sent aides. Bobby sent a guy named Peter Edelman, who ended up becoming the husband of Marion Edelman, who we had met down there. And they came back, and of course they said there are in fact people starving. There is this crazy thing in the food stamp program. You need money to be able to buy food stamps, even though you're supposed to be impoverished to buy them. And Orville Freeman changed the rules of the food stamp program. So there were, I can't say there were no starving people in America after Bobby Kennedy's visit, but there were fewer starving people. So on a political level, that's what he did. The other thing he did is he went home that Sunday afternoon to the enormous estate that he lived in McLean, Virginia, called Hickory Hill. And he went into his living room, into his dining room, which was as big as the hovel that 15 people would live in Mississippi. And he told his kids the story that he had seen about hunger in America. And he said to them, you have got to do something in your life. You will all decide individually what you do, but you have to do something that makes a difference, because there are families of 15 that are living in a room the size of our dining room, and you've been given all these opportunities, and you've got to make a difference. And the extraordinary thing to me about that story that he told the kids was, at my first book talk in Boston, which was at the venerated Fenway Park, at the back of the room there was a young woman named Kathleen Kennedy, Bobby's oldest child, and she repeated for me the speech that he gave 50 years before verbatim. It has so stuck with her. And so he made a difference to America, and he made a difference to his kids and to his family that day. And there are not many politicians that would have gotten down on the floor with a little boy, and there are no politicians that I can think of that would have made a difference with their family and with the food stamp program in America. And that was the new Bobby Kennedy. That was not the Bobby Kennedy of 57 working for McCarthy. It was not the Bobby Kennedy who was working for his brother as Attorney General, who started out clueless about these kinds of issues. But that was how Bobby Kennedy was evolving. And by 1966, that was who he'd become.
Can I ask a little bit about the process of doing this book? I'm sure at the start there were people who said, another Kennedy book, Lord, just what publishing needs. Were you in competition with the obit writers to try to track down people, to find people who could tell the stories? You've just told a couple of wonderful stories that are from observers, people who were there. What was it like to try to retrace this incredible life, 50 years after the fact?
So my friend Eileen, who is the toughest reporter I know, is also incredibly polite. What the question really was, why did we need the 101st book on Bobby Kennedy? And the answer is partly because I don't know what you know about how you sell books to publishers, but it's not a scientific process. It's who the 5 people are in the room when you're sitting down with them. And I had written a couple previous books for the publisher I was trying to sell. Your publisher gets a right of first refusal on the next one if they've published the last one. And I'm sitting down at a publishing house called Random House with 5 people. One of them is my agent who believes in the book. One of them is my editor that believes in the book. And the other 2 are the publisher and the deputy publisher. Well, the publisher's first job in the world was as an intern for Ted Kennedy. So she was on board for the 101st book from sort of moment one. The deputy publisher's first memory of the whole political world was hearing when he was a kid about the death of Robert Kennedy when he was in grade school. And so he was on board. So they were an easy sell. The answer on why I think we needed a book on him, was that your question? What was reminding me of what you said?
It was, how did you find the people? Were there people still
so
there?
There weren't many. So I interviewed for this book probably between 400 and 450 people. And it's 2 things happened to me that had never happened to me in what I've done in journalism or in books before. One was that literally in half the people that I interviewed, and this was a very strange experience because these people were in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and half the people at some point during the interview cried. And it wasn't because I pinched them or said something mean to them. It was because no matter what they did, and I'm talking about people who went on to become Attorney General of the United States, their time with Bobby Kennedy 50 years later still meant enough to them that just remembering the promise that this guy offered and the idea that at the moment of his greatest political victory after the California primary, he was taken from us, made them cry. So that was the kind of emotional response that he generated. But the other weird thing that happened with this book was, and again, it wasn't anything that I did, I promise you, that easily a third of the people that I interviewed, by the time I finished the book 3 years later, were gone. And so whether I wrote a good book or a bad book, nobody will ever be able to write a book like that on Bobby Kennedy today, because the people who were his contemporaries, this makes me feel very old, what I'm about to say, and I suspect it will do the same thing to a lot of you. But last November, Bobby would have turned 90.
Wow.
And in my mind, he's always the 42-year-old guy who died in
Right.
1968. And the chance of writing about him in a first-person sense of getting these people is just not out there anymore. And I came along at a strange and magical moment where enough of the Kennedy siblings were gone that the idea of their circling the wagons the way they historically did and having their people never breathe a word of any of their stories was gone. There was nobody to circle the wagons anymore. So I got them in a moment where most of them still had a fairly decent memory, and yet there was no Kennedy to tell them not to talk. And it was magical. And so people who hadn't talked before talked at substantial length, including a woman who just turned 88 named Ethel Kennedy. And I would like to tell you it is because I'm a charming guy that Ethel Kennedy talked at length for the first time, but it's because she sensed her mortality. And I was the guy who happened to show up on her doorstep when she was sensing it was me or nobody. And so it was just magical. So if I couldn't write a book worthy of them, then shame on me. But these people were opening up in a way they hadn't before in Bobby. And it was...
That's remarkable. It's remarkable. I think we passed each other in the Palm Beach airport, didn't we, that day?
We did.
Turns out that she had a few things to say about Eunice, too.
So you've got to, I hope it's going to be soon, but when her book comes out, it is going to be something quite extraordinary, because Eileen McNamara has a capacity to make people who never thought they would talk about anything, not only talk, but tell stories they've never, ever revealed to their closest relatives. And what she's going to, Eunice is the Kennedy women of the Jack and Bobby family were an extraordinary generation, and they were so passed over, and Eunice is by far the most interesting one, so stay tuned for an amazing book. And I want to be back here getting to ask you the questions.
Well, you can abuse me as I'm abusing you. Well, tell me, when you came to the end of this process, I mean, you are 400 interviews. It's extraordinary, to say nothing of the archives that you dug through. And there were documents. Didn't the Kennedy family give you access to material that no one had ever seen before?
So I don't know whether it was because of me or it was just whimsical that it opened up. There were a lot of boxes of papers that were under lock and key here for a long time. And the Kennedy family, just when I was writing the book, agreed to open them. And I will not take credit for getting them opened. I will take credit for having the luck of having been around. But who knows why they did it then. But yeah, there were a lot of documents. There were, I mean, we're reporters, and you go out and you find documents. And so there were some wonderful things that were made available. There were old documents that hadn't been looked through in a long time. There were also the people who came before me. So everybody who writes a biography of the Kennedys stands on the shoulders of the million people. I stood on 100 shoulders of people who came before. And there were some amazing things in Arthur Schlesinger's files. There were amazing things that a really terrific biographer named Evan Thomas wrote a biography on Bobby. But I came along later and so had access to more things. I had access to all of their files which were around, and I had access to all these people who were telling their stories. And I think that whether or not I wrote a good biography, if I couldn't, shame on me, but also so I mentioned talking to Ethel, the other one who was extraordinary, who was quite close-mouthed and talking about her family and telling details about them is not her favorite thing to do in the world, but there was one sibling left, and that was Jean Kennedy Smith. And she was extraordinary. And I went to the hairdresser with her, I went to lunch with her, I spent enough time with her that she was willing to say things, and she said things to you that I'm sure are going to be a lot better, but I think she was great.
Were there questions you had that you just couldn't answer? That all those interviews and all those archives, were there still questions about Bobby that you had that lingered at the end? Things you wished you knew, things you could never know?
There were 100 of them, and I wish that so one of my best sources, I spent a good part of my journalism life. I was a journalist for 20 years, and for 15 of them was at the Boston Globe, and because most of my time there was either as a health reporter or as an environmental reporter, by default, one of my best sources was a guy named Ted Kennedy. And the tragedy for me was that he died shortly before I wrote the book, and I wish I could have asked him. I wanted to know what Ted thought. I think that Ted Kennedy actually, before I say what I'm about to say, I want to say that you never give a book talk before a book is out. And the only book talk that I've ever done before a book was out was when Eileen and I did a session like this at the Ted Kennedy Center for the Senate. And it was a blast because Ted Kennedy was a big piece of the Bobby Kennedy story. And I'm convinced that Ted Kennedy spent his 50 years in the Senate trying to be Bobby. He was not trying to be Jack. Jack was not a great senator. He was, I think, had potential to be a really great president, but his time in the Senate was preparing to run for president. Bobby, because he saw how short life could be, spent his 4 years in the Senate trying to cram in as much and get as much done, assuming that he might not make it beyond the first 6 months. And so he was an extraordinary senator. And Ted Kennedy so adored Bobby. Their favorite times when they were both senators together, they had in those days very little security in the Senate. And they had private doors that went into the senator's private office. And they were back and forth perpetually. If his staff couldn't find Bobby, they knew he was off seeing Ted. And Ted's staff knew that he was in Bobby's private office. And they adored one another. And Ted Kennedy was so appreciative of what Bobby Kennedy had done in starting the experiment on fighting poverty that was called Bedford-Stuyvesant in the biggest ghetto in America, in taking us out of Vietnam, standing up in the Senate and saying something that nobody ever says in the Senate, which was, mea culpa, I was wrong. I helped get us into Vietnam, and I'm now going to try to help get us out of Vietnam. He did extraordinary things, and Ted took his cue from Bobby on all those things, and he became exactly the senator, I think, that Bobby would have loved to, that Bobby was, and that Bobby would have loved to have seen his younger brother become. And I would have loved to have talked to Ted Kennedy and heard his intimate stories. He gave us his sanitized stories in his memoir. Right. The real stories about what those two did, they also wreaked havoc anytime they could, personally in terms of just, they would go together when the Kennedy parents told them never to be at the Hyannisport place alone. They would go up in the garage and play hooky from school and hang out together at the Kennedy estate in Hyannisport. And I would love to have known what they did there. There were stories behind the scenes that Ted could have told that Eunice, had I ever been around then, could have and would have loved to have told in much more colorful terms than any of the boys could have done. I mean, I would have loved to have known what it was really like at the dinners in Hyannisport in a way that I don't think that any of them ever told the story, and that Gene Smith wouldn't have told in the colorful ways that Eunice and Teddy. There were a million things. Anybody who tells you they wrote a biography and didn't have more unanswered questions than questions they could answer is either not a good biographer or not an honest person.
Right. Well, it is, of course, the most presumptuous thing you can do, to think that you're going to sit down and somehow you're going to encapsulate this life. But you got to make the shot, right? Because there's so much that you want to say, and you want the person memorialized, right?
You do, and so I started out with Bobby Kennedy. When I was in high school, I went to high school with the most tender of Bobby Kennedy's kids named David Kennedy, the one who took the loss most to heart of his father and who died of a drug overdose years later, because I'm convinced he never truly recovered from that. And I had on my high school wall the famous Bobby Kennedy stolen quote about some people, I'm going to get it wrong, as I always do, but some people see things the way they are and ask why, and others dream of the way they could have been and ask why not. And
George Bernard Shaw.
George Bernard Shaw via Bobby Kennedy via George Bernard Shaw and lots of other people. And I started out writing the book with Bobby Kennedy as my hero, and then I saw all of Bobby Kennedy's flaws, and like any journalist, you write about those and you talk to people and you're influenced by that. And I ended up at the end of the book with him being more of a hero than he ever was, because the only real hero that means something to me is one who is a flesh and blood hero, that you know their good side and you know their bad side. And by the end, Bobby Kennedy started out, I didn't exactly adore the Bobby Kennedy who was this loyal partisan of Joe McCarthy and who couldn't see all the victims, by the time he went to work for McCarthy, all the victims of McCarthy that were out there. Bobby Kennedy was so single-minded that he couldn't see that stuff. But by the end, I tried to judge Bobby by the Bobby Kennedy of 1968 standards, and those were about as high a standard as you could ever get in a politician. No saint, but by the end, a politician who in today's terms was one of the only politicians that I've seen who was in the process of uniting the angry white Donald Trump supporters of today, who were Bobby's supporters going back to 1957, and the Hillary Clinton coalition of liberals and minorities. He was building bridges that have never been built, and he may be the one politician who I think could have really brought America together in 1968. And as all of you know, because you're all smart and historians of America, the 1968 America is in so many ways reminiscent of the 2016 America. And what we need today is somebody who can bring people together the way Bobby Kennedy promised to do at the moment of his death.
I feel like I should end on that note, but I want to ask you one more thing. Among the many things that Bobby did in his time as Attorney General and in the Senate, he did pursue Hoffa vigorously. He also, in the AG's office, ran Operation Mongoose, which was our efforts to subvert, if not assassinate, Fidel Castro in Cuba. How much of Bobby's grief at Jack's death was the fear that somehow his work and his aggression in the way he did his work for his brother, the president, could have wound up contributing to his brother's death?
So this is me as pop psychologist, and I may be right or I may be wrong, but I'm totally convinced that I'm right, that I think after his brother's death, so Bobby Kennedy, as you may know, is one of the only people who was close to that administration who never was interviewed by the Warren Commission. They gave him a pass. They gave Jackie a pass and they gave Bobby a pass. And I'm convinced that Bobby thought that the truth story would never come out until he was president and controlled all the levers of investigation. But I'm also convinced that Bobby thought that he may be responsible for his brother's death. Could it have been when he went after the mafia? And he did it in a way that no attorney general had ever done. Could it have been when he went after Jimmy Hoffa? And Jimmy Hoffa certainly, had he wanted to do something, had the kind of contacts that he could have done it. And most scarily to Bobby Kennedy, could it have been when he launched Operation Mongoose, which among other things envisioned Castro being dead? Could it have been the hornet's nest that he stirred up in going after Castro that came back to bite his own brother? And Bobby used to say to anybody who would ask, he said, it ought to have been me and not Jack. And I think that there's not a night that Bobby Kennedy went to bed that somewhere in the back of his head wasn't the idea that his friend, his closest friend in the world, may no longer be with us because of something that he did. And that's not a pleasant thought, and it's not something that, it just must have tortured him.
So that transformation is expiation of some of that guilt in part?
it's everything. I'm not Catholic and you are, and you can tell me more how we deal with guilt and how Bobby did, but I think he had guilt, I think he had love, I think he got out of that whole experience a sense that the Greek tragedies that he was reading were the story of the Kennedys, a story of great hubris and a story of great loss and tragedy, and I think he saw himself in that. And we are all, if I went out and interviewed everybody who was here tonight, we are all some combination of tough and tender. And I think Bobby Kennedy of 1957, the dial was over on the tough side. Starting in 63, it was moving closer and closer to the tender. And the Bobby Kennedy that we lost that night of the California primary in 1968 makes me want to cry when I think of what that loss meant to America.
Right. And so many of the people that you interviewed did cry.
And I've never had an experience as a journalist where grown people in their 70s and 80s cried that way, and they cried because this was a loss. They went on, as I mentioned before, some of them went on to become attorney general or senator or whatever, and they still had a sense that that magical moment of 68 offered something that they never saw repeated in their 50 years after that.
Right. I'm going to open it up to you because, as Larry says, you're all historians, you're Bostonians, so you know the story of this family better than Larry and I do. And the best questions always come from the audience. So please.
A few years ago, Bobby's niece, Maria Shriver, stood on this stage and introduced a documentary about Sergeant Shriver, Bobby's brother-in-law. And a scene I remember vividly somewhat contradicts what you said. In the movie, I think it was Eunice was saying that when Mrs. King was grieving when Martin Luther King was arrested, Sergeant said to Jack Kennedy, give her a call and give her moral support. And Bobby said, don't you dare call her, it's going to lose me, it's going to lose you, the South. And Jack listened to Shriver, and he made the call, and after that, Bobby didn't speak to him for 2 years. That was in the movie. Now, nothing in the movie talked about whether he made a call to get King out of jail, but it seemed like his attitude was diametrically opposite to what you described.
Yes, it was. And so I don't want to suggest that Bobby Kennedy would ever not have told the entire truth. It would have been play acting with something. But what happened was the official story was exactly what you just recounted. The official story was that Jack Kennedy, from his hotel room, I think at Kennedy Airport, what later was called Kennedy Airport, that Jack Kennedy made a phone call to Mrs. King, encouraged in part by Sergeant Shriver. He calls Coretta King and Harris Wofford and calls Coretta King and says, I feel your pain, and a phone call that was sympathetic and useless, and that Bobby Kennedy was outraged and yelled at Sergeant Shriver and yelled at Wofford and never forgave them. And that was a great spin in the story. That was a lot better spin than the true story that came out years later when the sentencing judge and everybody else started talking about it. Partly because, how many lawyers in the audience? Yeah, so great. The ethics of a lawyer calling a sentencing judge behind the scenes and saying, can you let him out of jail? And by the way, if we make it to the White House, you'll be a welcome guest at the White House. The ethics of doing that aren't something that Bobby would have wanted to advertise. The ethics of then going to every black church in America and the Sunday before the election handing out a leaflet. Richard Nixon, when he was asked what he thought about the arrest of Martin Luther King, said, I've got no comment. And the leaflet that went out in every black church was, you have a choice on Election Day, voting for no comment Nixon or Jack Kennedy, the candidate with a heart. All of the stories about all of this came out years later. I wish I could say I was the first one to have publicized these, but I added some details, but it was very much not the story that Bobby Kennedy told and that was told in that film. And to me, that was a suggestion of Bobby Kennedy, the spinmeister. And he was as good a spinmeister. He never told the true stories of what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis story was supposedly that we went eyeball to eyeball with the Cubans and they backed down, and unilaterally that they took their missiles out of Cuba. The true story was that Bobby Kennedy met with Ambassador Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador, and said, if you take your missiles out of Cuba, we will take our missiles out of Turkey. And The only thing is, you can't make it look like a quid pro quo. We're going to do our missiles 2 or 3 months later, looking like it was a goodwill gesture. And if you make it look like it's happening at the same time, we'll back out of the deal. All of these stories, if they were told at the time, would have painted a different picture. So Bobby Kennedy, who had extraordinary loyalty to his brother, spun the stories. And what we're all doing in our books, that we have the benefit of history and people telling stories later, is we're trying to do a little unspinning. And one last thing I want to say about it, because I'm going on too long, is that when I unspun, I tried to use the standard in judging Bobby Kennedy, of the Bobby Kennedy of 1968, judging the Bobby Kennedy and the spinning he did in 1960. And he would have been merciless on himself. And so that was the way I tried to go in and correct a few things, like that great story. The film is great and it's a great story. It's just not true.
So that means that Eunice Kennedy didn't tell the truth in the documentary about what her husband told her Bobby Kennedy did to him.
Well,
So
I
you
would
come in.
I would
here.
argue this is what history is, right? It's your interpretation of what happened. I would argue that what Bobby did by calling the sentencing judge is the thing that made the biggest difference. But we both interviewed Harris Wofford for our books, right? Mm-hmm. And so I believe that story is also true. I don't think that it's certainly possible that Harris and Sarge tried to tell Jack to make that call. And so he made a nice goodwill call. I feel your pain, Mrs. King. But the thing that got action was Bobby's call.
Right. So what we don't know, because they're dead, unfortunately, is we can't sit down and say to Harris Wofford, I'm sorry,
Harris,
we can say to Harris, we can't say to Sergeant Shriver or to Eunice, did you know when you were telling the story in the film that in fact there was a more interesting and less favorable story?
And I can almost guarantee you that they didn't.
They didn't know,
because,
and they might not have.
Because it's sort of really extraordinary how much members of the family don't know about their own history. I mean,
But Shriver would know if Bobby didn't talk to him for 2 years.
Yeah, so he had other reasons for not, he had, one of the great mysteries to me, and something I gave 5 answers to but never answered satisfactorily, is why did Bobby Kennedy hate Sergeant Shriver so much? And everybody I talked to had a different version of why that was true, but I don't doubt that he didn't talk to him for 2 years. That was the...
Excuse me. Hi, I had a what-if question, which I believe with Bobby Kennedy is pretty endless, those kinds of questions, but mine is regarding American-Soviet relations. If Bobby Kennedy had become president, what would the 1970s have looked like? Would we have seen a détente like Nixon's? Would we have seen a different form of relations with the Soviet Union? How would that have materialized?
So I can say anything and nobody can prove me wrong, so I'm going to give you my take on that. So I want to start back with the premise of your question was, if Bobby Kennedy become president, and I want to tell you what I think was going to happen the day after the California primary. So you all remember, he wins not by an enormous margin, but by enough of a margin, he wins the California primary, the biggest political victory of his life. And you may be aware that the next day he was due to go to Chicago. And 50 years later, I interview a guy named Bill Daley, the son of the then mayor, Richard J. Daley. And Bill Daley says, it was almost a certainty that my dad the next day was going to endorse Bobby Kennedy for president. And I don't know what you remember of '68, but the most powerful establishment Democrat in America was Richard Daley. And all the politicians that I interview who are still alive from that era say, if Daley had endorsed him, that it would have set off a wave of endorsements. Hubert Humphrey, his main opponent, didn't enter one primary or have one vote. I am totally convinced that the ticket, because this is what politicians did back then, would have been Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey. I am more convinced that if you hadn't had the Chicago Convention and all the violence then, Hubert Humphrey, you'll recall, lost by a whisker to Richard Nixon. If you hadn't had Chicago and you had had Bobby Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey on the same ticket, and you will recall the one politician in America who knew Richard Nixon's vulnerabilities better than anybody else was the guy who 8 years before had led his brother Jack's successful campaign against Richard Nixon. If Bobby Kennedy had been the candidate against Richard Nixon, he would have won, and he would have won comfortably. And if he had won, I'm convinced, but more importantly, Fidel Castro is convinced 50 years later that it would have been a very different situation with the face-off between Cuba in America and between the Soviet Union in America. And Bobby Kennedy was a realist. Bobby Kennedy in the 1950s, with his buddy Justice Douglas of the Supreme Court, had visited the Soviet Union and had gotten down and dirty in the Soviet Union, visiting way outlying places. He understood what was going on there. He was a realistic enough politician. He was enough sensing where new directions and where he ought to position America. There would have been détente, I think, years before. There would have been a rapprochement with Cuba. Instead of it taking until Barack Obama, it would have happened with Bobby Kennedy. And you may know that there was a détente that over this last 50 years, an ongoing détente between Ethel Kennedy and Fidel Castro. They became great buddies. They would meet regularly, and they talked about what Bobby and Fidel could have accomplished if Bobby had been president. So again, nobody can prove me wrong, but I think a lot of things would have gotten better quickly, and we would sure as heck have been out of Vietnam quicker than Richard Nixon took us out of Vietnam. And one last thing, and this is a question you didn't ask. So I think you all know that Joe Kennedy's dream for his sons was that every one of them would eventually become president. You also may know that Rose Kennedy's dream, all she wanted was one of her boys to become a priest. And if Jack Kennedy had become a priest, in my mind, he would have been the Pope, because that was who Jack Kennedy was. He was a little bit above things, and he liked the sort of regal titles and all. If Bobby Kennedy had been a priest, he would have been a parish priest, because that was who he was. And I think he would have had the patience, in 5 minutes after he had become president, he would have tried to do the things that Jack Kennedy said he was waiting until being reelected in 1964 to do. And that was giving us a really strong civil rights bill. That was getting us out of Vietnam. That was doing all the tough things. So he understood how short life could be, and he would have been amazing immediately.
That was going to be my question. So I'll ask this one instead. Can you give us a brief understanding of the complex relationship between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson? Did or did not Bobby Kennedy try to stop Lyndon Johnson from being the vice presidential candidate for his brother? I know many historians have written about this and said many different things about it, but I was just wondering what your take is after all your research and interview. It seems like they had an extremely complicated relationship, but I'm more interested in knowing, did or did not Bobby Kennedy want Johnson to be his brother's running mate? Thank you.
So if I were going to be really brief, I would just say no.
No.
I mean, Bobby Kennedy in his life had 4 people he hated more than anybody else. And I think the choice on 3 of them was pretty good. One of them was a guy named Roy Cohn. One of them was a guy named J. Edgar Hoover. One of them was a guy named Jimmy Hoffa. And unfortunately, the 4th one was Lyndon Johnson. And I trust the extraordinary historian Robert Cairo in terms of where the depth of antipathy came from. And it came from the first moment that they met, when Bobby Kennedy was a young staffer working for Joe McCarthy, and he was introduced to LBJ, the senator. And there was something like 2 dogs with the hair on the back of their head going up as soon as they met one another. And I think it was that Lyndon Johnson came from East Texas and was dirt poor and hated what he called the Harvards. And Bobby Kennedy was the perfect Harvard, who had grown up with a silver spoon and given all the entitlement that Johnson never had. So Bobby Kennedy did try to keep Johnson off the ticket. When Jack wanted him on the ticket, he absolutely did not keep going on that, because he was not about to buck his brother Jack on something that important. And the idea that they hated one another is one of the great political tragedies of the 1960s, because had the 2 of them combined forces to fight poverty, to fight for a strong civil rights bill, we could have gotten even more accomplished much faster, and it's a tragedy.
And that actually, that answers a little bit the question of the woman who wanted to know why this antipathy toward Sergeant Shriver. After President Kennedy was killed, a lot of the Bobby people left the administration. They didn't stay to work for Lyndon Johnson. Sergeant Shriver not only stayed and continued to run the Peace Corps, he ran the war on poverty for Lyndon Johnson, and that was Bobby's war. And that was Bobby's issue, and Sergeant Shriver was doing it for his sworn enemy. And then Bobby decided to run for president. And Sergeant Shriver went to Paris as the ambassador to France for Lyndon Johnson.
Exactly. So that's a brilliant telling of the story. And the one other little piece of it was when Lyndon Johnson wanted to tweak Bobby Kennedy in the days after Jack's death, he suggested Bobby was sort of putting himself off as a potential vice presidential candidate in 1964 on that ticket. And Johnson was never going to pick Bobby, and Bobby knew he was never going to pick him. But Johnson tweaked Bobby by suggesting maybe we'll pick Sergeant Shriver. And Bobby Kennedy had the perfect retort, which was, if it's going to be a Kennedy, it's going to be a real Kennedy.
And I believe that is, exactly right. And there are people, just as there were Bobby people and there were Jack people, there are Sarge people. And there are people in the Sarge camp who'll never forgive Bobby Kennedy because they think Sarge would have made a great vice president. And there are people, like Harris Wofford, who'll never forgive Eunice because whether this is apocryphal or not,
It's a great story.
the story is that Eunice put in a call to LBJ to say, if there's anybody going on that ticket, it's my brother, not my husband.
I don't think you have to have met Lyndon Johnson to dislike him. Growing up in the 60s, yes. One name that's been absent in the discussion tonight, but I think is extremely significant when you talk about 1968, and that's Eugene McCarthy. Do you feel that Eugene McCarthy opened the door for Bobby Kennedy, set the way, and then Bobby kind of pushed Eugene out of the way, saying, you showed me the way, now thank you?
So,
You haven't heard this before. Bobby's an opportunist.
exactly, seriously. So Bobby Kennedy had spent all the time since 1957 trying to outrun the word ruthless. And the way he jumped into the presidential race in 1968, every reporter in America wanted to dub him ruthless. You will recall that Eugene McCarthy takes on this very popular sitting president who in 1964 is won in a landslide. McCarthy is a know-nothing senator from Minnesota who has one issue, which is Vietnam, and he takes on Johnson in New Hampshire, and he beats him. And exactly 4 days later, Bobby Kennedy jumps into the race, which prompts Murray Kempton, the columnist, to write a brilliant telegram to Ted Kennedy saying, what your brother did in entering the presidential race shows that St. Patrick didn't drive all the snakes out of Ireland. The only better, I love that one, but my only better one is what Lady Bird Johnson's press secretary says, it took Bobby Kennedy 20 years to come out against McCarthy, and he picked the wrong McCarthy. All of those make great copy, and if Eileen and I were journalists then, we would have written the stories that way. But as a lot of journalists and other people, including our colleague Marty Nolan, this ex-Globe guy who introduced me at Fort Talks a couple weeks ago in San Francisco, 9 days before that New Hampshire primary, Bobby Kennedy told Marty Nolan and a whole bunch of other people that he was definitely entering the primary. And instead of being ruthless or opportunistic, he was ham-handed, but he wanted to give McCarthy a clear shot at LBJ. He'd been fighting him for months in New Hampshire. Bobby had been late in getting into the race. And so he ended up, that entire campaign, having to outrun the label of opportunist or ruthless, when this is one of the few times that label was not warranted for him. And he hated Gene McCarthy, and Gene McCarthy hated him. And there are 10 theories on why. My theory is that they were two incredibly different people who were competing to be the #1 Catholic in America. They were two different people in that McCarthy was an intellectual and probably should have been a college professor, and Bobby Kennedy was a street fighter and a grassroots guy. And Bobby Kennedy rightfully held against Eugene McCarthy the fact that McCarthy was a one-issue candidate. Bobby Kennedy in 1968, in my mind, and this is my bias, he was right on the Vietnam War, but he was also right on wanting to end poverty in America and wanting a civil rights bill. McCarthy knew nothing about poverty, and he didn't do anything to fight for civil rights. And so Bobby Kennedy despised him as being a one-issue guy.
Thank you. So one of the words that you used to describe Bobby tonight is patient and
what I know about him, what you've said, there's a lot of thoughtfulness, and he's very deliberate in the things he does. I know that Bobby probably could have won a lot of campaigns today. As you said, he was an aggressive campaigner, a grassroots guy. But in today's age of 24/7 news and social media and just constant flashpoint and hot button issue, I guess the best way to phrase this is, could Bobby Kennedy have been Bobby Kennedy today? And if so, how would he have managed that task?
So it's a great question, and again, the short answer is yes, and more so. That he could have been, I said Bobby Kennedy was patient. I said he's incredibly impatient, and he would have loved this 24-hour news cycle because he had no patience at all. The idea of getting out there and saying something and being willing to do it 5 minutes later, he was so passionate about issues that he would have adored that. And the idea of most candidates today, one of the reasons I think Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump don't make themselves available to the press much is too much exposure to them isn't going to make them look better. In Donald Trump's case, I would take away the might not, and it definitely wouldn't make him look better. Bobby Kennedy was so authentic and so authentic to the press covering him that the more times he was exposed in a camera or any other way, the more it would have made people like Dick Black Death Harwood like this guy even more. He was just, there was no such thing with overexposure bringing down his standing.
Okay.
Anyway, so can I say one last thing here, which is that I don't consider myself an expert in many things. I know a little bit now about Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy family, but one of the things that I'm an expert on, that I wrote an entire book on, is a character in American folklore known as Superman. And I want to just say, I'm also an expert in my pal here, Eileen, and I want to just, in ending here tonight, give her a little bit of a Superman shirt, because I think she is a superwoman, and she's going to do an incredible book on Eunice. And can we thank Eileen McNamara for...
Look at that.
Love you. And I just have to say one last thing, which is the Kennedy Library was extraordinary. Everybody always writes in their acknowledgments, you know, you've got to write, say something nice about the local library, and if it's a family library. The Kennedy Library, I don't know behind the scenes all the things they did in getting Ethel and the family to open up the books, open up the papers on perfect timing for me, but there are 100 ways I could sit here and describe to you things that they did to make my job a whole lot easier. So if we could have just one last round of applause for the Kennedy Library and the foundation that supports it.
Thank you all for coming. There is another Kennedy Forum next Wednesday night. You can find it on the website. So come back.
And again, the book will be signed if you want to get the books around.
Thank you.